Welcome back to True Echo, where real courage echoes across generations. Today's story is one you will never forget. It's about sacrifice, family, betrayal, and redemption. A retired black soldier gave up everything, his medals, his honor, for a future he might never live to see. Decades later, the truth he hid comes roaring back, shaking the halls of power. Stay with us as we uncover a story of silent heroism and the sons who fought to give it the voice it always deserved. Blood stained Elijah Harper's handkerchief again as another raw cough racked his thin chest. He quickly tucked it away when he heard the front door swing open and the thud of duffel bags hitting the floor. His boys, David and Daniel, were home. 17 years old, identical down to the stubborn set of their chins, and bursting with more potential than Elijah had ever dared to dream for them. "Hey, Dad," Daniel called, bounding into the living room with his usual restless energy. "Coach said I broke the obstacle course record." David followed more calmly, dropping onto the worn couch, his posture already hinting at the soldier he aspired to be. "Yeah. Broke the record, and nearly his neck showing off on the wall climb," he added dryly, exchanging a smirk with Elijah. Elijah laughed, but the sound ended in a low rattling wheeze he tried to mask with a cough. He waved them closer. "Come here, you two." They settled on either side of him, and for a moment, Elijah just looked at them, memorizing the way the evening light caught in their hair, the pride and ambition glowing in their eyes. They deserved everything. A future. A shot. A chance to climb higher than he'd ever been allowed. "You'll never guess who came to school today," Daniel said. "Lieutenant Wilson, recruiter for Anderson Military Academy." Elijah's heart skipped. He knew that name well. Anderson, the launch pad for officers, a gateway to West Point, to greatness. But also, tuition that cost more than their truck, the house, and every worn stick of furniture inside it combined. "He said we both have what it takes," David added, trying to sound casual but failing to hide the excitement in his voice. "Yeah," Daniel said, bouncing in place. "But there's a summer prep program. And there's a fee." They didn't need to say the number. Elijah saw it in their eyes, the hope, the shame at asking, the desperate need to believe in possibilities bigger than their paycheck-to-paycheck lives. Elijah smiled, masking the pain that twisted in his chest. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. That night, after they had gone to bed, Elijah sat alone staring at the medals on the wall. Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. Each one a chapter written in blood and regret. He traced the Silver Star gently, remembering not the heroism in the official citation, but the terror, the mistakes, the friends lost. By morning his decision was made. At Johnson's pawn shop, he laid the velvet box on the counter. Johnson, a grizzled Navy veteran himself, looked at it and then up at Elijah with slow, respectful eyes. "These real?" Johnson asked. "As real as the scars that came with them," Elijah answered. They haggled, but not much. Johnson offered a fair price. Enough to cover the summer program, the application fees, and a few hundred left over in case the roof gave in before winter. As Elijah walked out, the little bell above the door jingled mournfully behind him. He didn't look back. Elijah returned home just as the sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised shadows across the cracked sidewalk. Inside, the house was silent except for the soft murmur of the twins' voices upstairs, no doubt studying or plotting their next adventure. He leaned against the doorframe for a moment, the velvet bag heavy in his pocket, the weight of what he had done even heavier on his heart. At dinner, he spun them a story about a scholarship fund for veterans' children. He told it with enough detail, enough practiced pauses, that even David, the skeptical one, believed it without question. Daniel was practically vibrating with excitement, rattling off plans for training, prep classes, even the uniform fittings. "You see, Dave?" Daniel said, elbowing his brother. "Told you things would work out." Elijah just smiled and sipped his coffee, hiding the way his hands trembled. He didn't dare let them see the man who had pawned his past to buy their future. The next few weeks passed in a blur of applications, fitness tests, recommendation letters. Elijah was everywhere, driving them to interviews, standing on the sidelines during physical trials, nodding along at meetings where words like officer track and scholarship candidate were spoken with admiration. At night, though, the coughing got worse. He hid the bloodstains from them, changed the pillowcases himself, and ignored the referral to the VA specialist stuffed in his glove box. He couldn't afford to be weak. Not yet. When the acceptance letters came, delivered in thick, impressive envelopes, the house erupted into whoops and laughter. Daniel tackled David in a hug, and even the usually reserved David hooped with a grin that cracked his careful composure. Elijah watched, his vision swimming slightly, pride burning through his chest harder than any fever. That night, as he packed their duffel bags for the summer prep program, he paused over their photos from childhood, two gap-toothed boys in second-hand clothes, beaming from a battered swing set he'd patched together himself. He had tried to give them everything he hadn't had growing up: stability, respect, a father's unwavering love. And now, for the first time, they were poised to leap beyond the small, worn-down town of Millfield. Beyond the limitations he'd fought all his life. It was all he ever wanted. But in the darkness of his room, another coughing fit seized him so violently he dropped to one knee. When it passed, he tasted copper at the back of his throat. For a terrifying moment, he thought he wouldn't be able to stand back up. He wiped the blood on his pajama sleeve and forced himself upright. Just a little longer, he thought. Just until they were fully launched. Then whatever happened to him didn't matter. The morning they left for Anderson, Elijah drove them to the bus station in his beat-up Ford, the heater rattling in the June air. As they hugged him goodbye, Daniel whispered fiercely, "We'll make you proud, Dad." "You already have," Elijah rasped, pulling them both into a crushing embrace. He stood at attention as the bus pulled away, his salute crisp, unwavering as the vehicle rumbled down the road carrying his heart with it. Only when the bus was a speck on the horizon did Elijah let his arm fall. Only then did he allow himself to sit down on the cold metal bench, bury his face in his hands, and grieve quietly for the medals he'd left behind, and for the years he knew he likely wouldn't see. The house was emptier than Elijah had ever remembered. Without the twins thundering up and down the stairs or raiding the fridge at all hours, the silence pressed against him like a heavy, invisible hand. He kept busy in the first few days, fixing the front steps, patching a leak in the roof, sanding down an old dresser he'd been meaning to refinish for years. Anything to keep from thinking too hard about how quiet the place had become. But the coughs were harder to ignore now. Violent, racking fits that left him breathless, his muscles aching from the effort. He told himself it was just the lingering bronchitis. He told himself he could fight through it like he always had. Then came the day he collapsed in the kitchen, the sound of the falling coffee mug shattering against the floor barely registering as he fought to draw air into his burning lungs. Mrs. Tanner, the neighbor, found him hours later when she came over with a plate of cornbread. She called the ambulance over his weak protests, riding with him in the back as the EMTs worked to stabilize his breathing. At Millfield General Hospital, tests were run, x-rays taken, blood drawn. The diagnosis was grim but unsurprising. Stage 3 lung cancer rapidly progressing. Probably from exposure to burn pits overseas, the young doctor said with a grimace. A tragically common story among veterans of Elijah's generation. "You've got options, Mr. Harper," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice gentle but firm. "Chemo, radiation. There are experimental treatments we could try." Elijah listened politely but shook his head. The treatments would drain what little savings he had left. They would tie him to hospital beds and poison his body for months, maybe years. And for what? A few extra months? No. His boys were the future. He had already given them everything. He had no regrets. He signed the palliative care forms without hesitation, requesting to be sent home. The VA provided a small oxygen machine, a monthly check-in nurse, and pain medication he mostly ignored unless absolutely necessary. He told no one, not David, not Daniel, not even Mrs. Tanner. They all had their own battles to fight. He wasn't going to burden them with his. Meanwhile, across the country, David and Daniel thrived at Anderson Military Academy. Their letters arrived weekly, sometimes long and detailed, sometimes hurried notes squeezed in between grueling schedules. Elijah read every one of them until the paper grew soft from handling. David was top of his class in tactics and leadership. Daniel had broken records in physical training and was already being scouted for Army intelligence roles. They were soaring. Exactly as Elijah had always dreamed. One Saturday evening, after a particularly rough coughing spell, Elijah pulled out the old VHS tapes again. He watched grainy footage of his younger self, laughing, wrestling with his squad mates, celebrating in muddy tents. Then came the footage from the day he'd received the Silver Star. Not the ceremony, that was neatly staged and photographed, but the moments before, caught by a friend's handheld camera. Elijah, uncomfortable in his dress uniform, fiddling with his tie, muttering about how Peterson should be the one standing there if life were fair. "You don't get to pick who makes it home," someone said behind the camera. "I know," Elijah answered softly. "Doesn't mean it feels right." The screen flickered and went black. Elijah sat there long after the tape ended, the silent hum of the old TV filling the room. He thought about Peterson. About all the others. about the faces he still saw in dreams. Men and women who had trusted him, who had stood beside him when the world came crashing down around them. And then he thought about David and Daniel, the new generation. The living proof that sacrifice had been worth something. When the coughing started again, deep and wet, he didn't bother reaching for the handkerchief. He just let it come. He had made his choices. And he would see them through to the end. Months drifted by like autumn leaves falling, beautiful, inevitable, unstoppable. Elijah's body weakened steadily, but he remained stubbornly independent. He sanded the porch railings until his hands bled. He cleaned the gutters, gasping for breath with every movement. He even volunteered twice a week at the local community center, teaching woodcarving to restless kids who needed someone, to believe in. It was during one of these afternoons that he met Jalen Williams. 14, scrawny, sharp-eyed. A Marine's son, orphaned by a training accident and left to drift between a tired mother working double shifts and a town too small to hold his anger. Elijah saw something of himself in the boy, a burning restlessness, a desperate need for structure, for purpose. He taught Jalen how to carve with steady hands, how to listen to the grain of the wood instead of forcing it. How patience was a kind of strength. The boy latched onto the lessons with a ferocity that broke Elijah's heart and gave him hope at the same time. "You got it, son," Elijah said one afternoon, handing Jalen a carefully sanded eagle figurine. "Strong wings. Sharp eyes. Just like you." Jalen beamed, clutching the carving like it was a medal of his own. Elijah realized with a pang that maybe he still had a little more to give after all. But at night, the pain gnawed at him like rats under the floorboards. He refused the stronger painkillers. He needed to stay sharp just a little longer. Long enough to see David and Daniel graduate. Long enough to know the world would remember them, not him, but the legacy he had built from nothing. Meanwhile, Anderson Academy loomed into its final year. David, ever the disciplined one, had secured a nomination to West Point. Daniel, unorthodox but brilliant, was deep into early acceptance for Army intelligence. Their futures, the futures Elijah had given up everything for, were almost within reach. Then came the news that shattered the fragile peace Elijah had built around himself. Daniel, reckless, passionate Daniel, had disobeyed a direct order during a joint field operation. A civilian village had been caught in a crossfire during a training exercise. Misinformation, bad intel, bureaucratic blindness. The higher-ups wanted silence. Sweep it under the rug. Acceptable losses. But Daniel had refused. He had acted on instinct, pulling families out of the danger zone, exposing the cover-up in the process. It saved lives, a lot of them, but it embarrassed the wrong people. A court of inquiry loomed. David had testified. According to the official version, Elijah pieced together from news clippings and whispered conversations. Not against his brother, not exactly, but David had stood with the chain of command. Hadn't defended Daniel's insubordination. The breach between them, the bond Elijah had spent a lifetime forging, had cracked wide open. For the first time in their lives, the twins were no longer speaking. Elijah felt the fracture as if it were in his own chest, a wound deeper and more final than cancer. He wanted to reach out. Wanted to tell them that sometimes right and wrong weren't clear-cut. That he too had once faced orders he couldn't follow. That he had thrown away his career, his health, his honor for the sake of a few civilians who didn't even know his name. He wanted to tell them that true heroism wasn't medals on a wall. It was living with the consequences of choosing conscience over command. But he couldn't find the words. Not yet. Not when they were both still so raw, so young, so convinced of their own truths. Instead, he recorded video messages, rough and imperfect, on an ancient camcorder Jalen helped him set up. One message for David, one for Daniel. He poured everything he couldn't say into those videos. Memories, regrets, pride, warnings. "You're both right," he said to the empty room. "You're both wrong. And you're both my legacy." The camcorder whirred quietly, capturing it all. Outside, winter crept closer. The first snows dusted the ground. Elijah watched from the porch, wrapped in an old army blanket, Jalen's half-finished eagle carving clutched in his gnarled hands. He was tired. So tired. But he wasn't done yet. Not while there was still truth to be spoken. Not while there was still a future left to fight for. In the heart of winter, when the sky hung low and gray and even the sun seemed weary, Elijah received a letter that changed everything. It wasn't from David or Daniel. It wasn't even from anyone he knew. It came from an anonymous sender, typed on plain white paper, and it carried a weight heavier than any bombshell. "Mr. Harper," it began. "Your son's futures are at risk. Project Ember is not forgotten. Project Ember. The name slammed into Elijah like a fist to the chest. He hadn't heard those words, not in decades. Not since the dusty desert, the burning village, the impossible orders. Not since he'd defied the command to slaughter innocents, only to be quietly discharged under a cloud of manufactured shame. He had buried that part of himself so deeply it had almost become a ghost story he told himself on sleepless nights. Now it was back. And if someone was willing to threaten him, threaten his boys, it meant the old ghosts weren't resting peacefully. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table, the letters spread before him, the oxygen machine humming softly in the corner. His mind raced, every instinct sharpened from years of battlefield survival. Who knew? What did they know? How much danger were David and Daniel truly in? He wanted to protect them, shield them from the darkness he had once walked through. But he couldn't protect them with silence anymore. Later that night, he pulled out the dusty box from the top shelf of his closet, the one he hadn't touched in 30 years. Inside were fragments of a life long buried. Mission reports with redacted lines, old photographs of men who never came home, a battered notebook where he had scrawled the truth when no one else dared to. He began recording again. This time, not just for his sons but for anyone who might one day need to know why he had done what he did. He spoke of Project Ember, of the classified mission to extract a rogue scientist from North Africa that had gone catastrophically wrong. Of the village full of civilians used as human test subjects. Of the orders to eliminate all witnesses. And of his decision to defy those orders. I wasn't a hero, he said into the camera, his voice cracking. I was a man who saw children running from burning homes and couldn't pretend they were enemies. He explained how Armitage Solutions, the private defense contractor embedded with their unit, had orchestrated the cover-up. How they had falsified satellite imagery, rewritten after-action reports, threatened careers and families to keep the truth buried. He spoke of the price he paid, the forced resignation, the stripped benefits, the whispers that followed him like a shadow. He spoke of the medals he had once hung on his wall with pride, and had later pawned away to send his sons to a better future. They told me I was dishonored, he said, tears blurring his vision. But I know better. And I raised my boys to know better too. When he finished, he slumped back in the chair, every bone in his body aching. He saved the recording onto a flash drive, which he hid inside the hollow base of the wooden eagle he and Jalen had been carving together. He would give it to his sons when they came home. If he lived long enough. Meanwhile, across the country, Daniel's curiosity had evolved into obsession. After uncovering hints of Project Ember during his intelligence work, he had started digging deeper, too deep. Firewalls meant to keep out foreign adversaries now served as barriers to truths his own government didn't want exposed. Files vanished. Warning messages flashed on his screen. Strange cars idled outside his apartment late at night. Still he pressed on. He decrypted communications between Armitage executives, traced payments that suggested bribery of government officials, found fragments of reports that confirmed what his father had only hinted at. But the more he uncovered, the more isolated he became. David's calls were few and far between, strained, cautious. His older brother, ever the good soldier, was still walking the thin line between loyalty to the system and loyalty to the truth. And Daniel couldn't blame him. He knew how seductive that uniform could be. How easy it was to believe that honor and obedience were the same thing. But he also knew, because Elijah had taught him, that sometimes the greatest acts of courage came from standing alone. One night, after hours spent poring over encrypted files, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. If you love your father, stop digging. The words were simple. The threat was not. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then deleted the message. He would not stop. Not now. Not ever. Because somewhere out there, the truth was waiting. And so was the future his father had sacrificed everything to give him. A sharp knock rattled Elijah's front door just after dawn. He shuffled across the worn floorboards, the oxygen machine hissing softly behind him, and opened it to find Jalen standing there, out of breath, his hands clenched around a crumpled newspaper. Mr. Harper. Jalen gasped. You have to see this. Elijah took the paper with trembling fingers, scanning the front page. His heart slammed against his ribs as he read the headline. Defense contractor Armitage Solutions linked to historic cover-up, whistleblower evidence emerging. There, beneath the bold text, was a blurry still image from his old camcorder, the one Jalen had secretly copied and uploaded without Elijah's knowledge. His confession, his story, his truth, all of it had broken into the world. Elijah sank heavily into his chair, the paper falling to his lap. Part of him felt fear, a gut-deep terror that old enemies would come for him, for his sons, for Jalen. But stronger than the fear was something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. He wasn't invisible anymore. The story he had carried like a weight for decades had finally found light. The house phone rang shrill and urgent. Was David? Is it true? His son's voice demanded. Dad, is it all true? Project Ember, the cover-up. Everything? Elijah closed his eyes. There was no point in hiding anymore. Yes, son, he rasped. It's true. On the other end of the line, David was silent. Then quietly, I'm coming home. Hours later, Daniel arrived too. He barreled through the door, dropping his duffel bag with a heavy thud, his face drawn tight with worry and determination. He hugged Elijah fiercely, careful of the 4 lines and the oxygen tubes. We're not going to let them bury this, Daniel said fiercely. Not anymore. David stood in the doorway, still in uniform, his face a complicated map of loyalty, guilt, and pride. Finally, he stepped forward and without a word, clasped his father's hand. For the first time in years, the 3 Harpers stood united. Elijah, weak but burning with a quiet fire, nodded at them. I need you boys to promise me something, he said. Promise me you won't let them twist this into something ugly. This was never about revenge. It's about truth. David and Daniel exchanged a look. The old twin bond rekindled, stronger than anger, stronger than pride. We promise, they said in unison. In the days that followed, a media storm unlike anything Millfield had ever seen descended on the little town. News vans lined the streets. Veterans from across the country came to stand outside Elijah's house, holding handmade signs. Honor Elijah Harper. Truth before orders. Real heroes save lives. Meanwhile, Armitage Solutions scrambled to contain the fallout. Denials, threats of lawsuits, whispered warnings through political back channels, all of it crumbling under the weight of the evidence Daniel had unearthed. The Department of Defense announced a formal investigation. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Whistleblowers from other units, soldiers who had long stayed silent out of fear, began to come forward, emboldened by Elijah's story. It wasn't just about Project Ember anymore. It was about every soldier who had ever been ordered to silence their conscience for the sake of appearances. And at the center of it all stood Elijah Harper. Too frail to leave his home, he watched it unfold from his recliner, Jalen at his side most days, reading him updates from the internet. One evening, Daniel burst into the house, a look of disbelief and wonder on his face. You're not going to believe this, he said, brandishing a thick manila envelope. Inside were official documents, signed and sealed, stating that Elijah Harper was being posthumously recommended for the Medal of Honor. He's not dead yet, Elijah growled, glaring at the wording, and the boys laughed, a bright, painful sound full of love and pride. A formal ceremony was being planned. The president himself was rumored to want to attend. Generals who had once turned a blind eye now clamored to be part of the redemption. But Elijah didn't care about ceremonies. He cared about the 2 young men sitting before him. Men he had raised with sacrifice and silence. Men who now carried his legacy forward with fire and honor. He closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at him, but not before he murmured the words he had carried for too long. You boys are my real medals. Outside, candles flickered along the sidewalks of Millfield, where strangers and neighbors alike stood vigil. A community, a nation was waking up. And Elijah Harper, old soldier, quiet hero, had finally been heard. The day of the ceremony dawned cold and bright, the kind of morning Elijah would have called a soldier's day. Clear, bracing, no excuses. Inside Millfield General Hospital, where Elijah had been moved under close observation, nurses bustled about preparing him for what would likely be the last and most public moment of his life. His skin was paper-thin, his muscles wasted, but his mind, that stubborn, indomitable spirit, was as sharp as ever. David and Daniel helped dress him in his old uniform, carefully smoothing the creases, polishing the tarnished buttons. It hung looser on him than it had in years past, but Elijah wore it like armor, head high, eyes steady. You look good, Dad, Daniel said, voice cracking slightly. Elijah smiled faintly. Might just fool God into thinking I'm coming up for inspection. They laughed, and it felt good even if it hurt. Outside the hospital, hundreds had gathered, veterans, civilians, students, families. News cameras broadcast live across the country. Flags flew at half-mast in silent salute. The Secretary of Defense, flanked by a detail of generals and congressional leaders, stood at a makeshift podium draped in red, white, and blue. At exactly noon, the ceremony began. David wheeled Elijah onto the platform, the old soldier sitting straighter than anyone expected. His eyes swept the crowd, not for fame, not for validation, but to see the faces of those he had lived and sacrificed for. The president approached, saluted Elijah crisply, and began to read the citation for the Medal of Honor. His voice was steady, solemn, the weight of history pressing down on every word. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. For choosing conscience over command, humanity over orders, and for preserving the ideals upon which this nation was founded. As the president placed the medal around Elijah's neck, the crowd erupted into applause, long, thunderous, unstoppable. Elijah blinked back tears. Not for himself, but for Peterson. For the civilians he had saved. For every soldier who had faced the impossible and dared to choose right over easy. He raised a trembling hand in salute, held it steady despite the pain. The nation for once saluted back. Later, in the quiet of his hospital room after the officials and cameras had gone, Elijah lay surrounded by his sons, by Jalen, by a dozen others whose lives he had touched without ever asking for anything in return. The medal glinted on his chest, but Elijah seemed almost unaware of it now. He looked at David, at Daniel, at Jalen. "Promise me," he whispered, each word an effort. "Promise me you'll keep fighting. Not with weapons, but with truth." They promised. Of course they did. He smiled then, a real, full smile, the weight of decades finally lifting. And as the sun set over Millfield, Elijah Harper, soldier, father, hero, closed his eyes for the last time, slipping quietly into a peace he had more than earned. The funeral was unlike anything the town had ever seen. Thousands came from across the country to pay their respects. Veterans in dress uniforms formed an honor guard stretching blocks. Children waved small flags. Families lined the streets, holding signs with messages like, "Honor before orders," and "Thank you, Elijah." David and Daniel led the procession, walking side by side behind the horse-drawn caisson bearing their father's casket. On top of it lay his old service jacket, the Medal of Honor shining bright, and beside it, the wooden eagle Jalen had finished with painstaking care. At the graveside, the final tributes were made. A 21-gun salute split the air. The solemn notes of taps echoed across the hills. David and Daniel each placed a single hand on the casket. Then, one by one, soldiers, citizens, children, people from every walk of life, came forward, placing medals, patches, personal notes atop the casket until it was a tapestry of gratitude, a monument built by the lives he had touched. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about headlines. It was about a man who had lived simply, loved fiercely, and taught by example that real heroism wasn't in medals or parades. It was in the choices made when no one was watching. In the quiet refusal to abandon what was right, no matter the cost. Years later, David and Daniel stood together once more, older now, wiser, but still carrying the spark their father had lit in them. They ran the Elijah Harper Foundation, awarding scholarships to young people who demonstrated courage not just in battle, but in everyday life, standing up to injustice, speaking truth to power, helping those who couldn't help themselves. Jalen, now a decorated officer himself, often spoke at military academies about the man who had taught him what it meant to lead with honor. And every year, on Elijah Harper Day, now a national holiday, thousands would gather to read aloud the words that had become his legacy. Truth above all. Because in the end, Elijah Harper's life proved something timeless and unshakable. A single act of conscience can change the world. And the echo of that courage can outlast any war, any cover-up, any silence. It can build a better future, one brave choice at a time. At its heart, Elijah Harper's story isn't just about medals or battles or headlines. It's about choosing conscience over convenience, truth over fear, and love over pride. It's about a father who gave everything, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the future of his sons and for the ideals he believed America could live up to. Even when the system turned its back on him, Elijah stood firm. Even when it cost him his health, his career, and his peace, he chose honor. And in the end, that quiet courage changed the course of history, not because he fought for glory but because he fought for what was right. At True Echo, we believe stories like Elijah's deserve to be remembered, honored, and shared, because they remind us that real heroism isn't loud. Steadfast. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to True Echo for more powerful true life stories that echo across generations. Comment below, what would you have done in Elijah's place? We read every single story you share. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the quiet battles often matter most. Sometimes, the greatest medals are not the ones you wear, but the ones you earn in the hearts of those you protect. Thank you for watching, and for keeping Elijah Harper's legacy alive.